Hello again. My name is Adam Elwanger. This is episode 10 of Whither the Looniversity, the podcast of the Peerless Review. And I'm very excited about my guest today. He is professor of psychology at Northwestern University in Illinois. Professor J. Michael Bailey is with me. He is an expert on sexual orientation and gender nonconformity. He's also the author of one of the best books I've read on gender identity. I have it right here. It is, oh, it's looking weird. The Man Who Would Be Queen. And this book right now, and you can get a copy on Kindle, but the physical copy is out of print right now. But Joseph Henry Press has a free PDF that you could download and read, which is associated with the National Academy of Sciences. And in the show notes to this episode, we'll put a link to that. In addition, Professor Bailey is in the middle of a study right now, studying perceptions, gender identity with gender dysphoric youth and their parents, along with Lisa Littman and Ken Zucker. That study promises to be a groundbreaking one. So today we will talk a little bit about the book, a little bit about gender politics, and certainly about the miserable state of the university. Professor Bailey, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Uh, Thanks, Adam, and we'll be calling each other by our first names, I hope.
Yes.
And I've really enjoyed. I think I've listened to all your episodes so far, and I've enjoyed them. I'm privileged that you invited me.
Well, thanks very much. So, as you know, the first thing I ask everybody is, how'd you get into psychology? Why psychology? Tell us the origin story of your sort of scholarly career.
Okay, so I uh, in the second half of the 70s, I was in college at Washington University in St. Louis. I was a math major. And uh, while taking math courses, I noticed two things that made me less enthusiastic. First, math was very abstract, and I don't know. I just felt like it wasn't addressing things that I cared much about. And second, at that time, Washington University had the best mathematicians in the country as students. It offered them, it recruited them specifically. I'm serious. They won the Putnam exam, or they were in the top finisher of the Putnam exam every year I was there.
Wow.
And these people, I was not in their league, not close. And I I think I was my junior year. I took a course that sounded interesting to me on it was a history course called The History of Freudian Thought
Mm,
by Gerald Eisenberg, who's a historian, and I was just uh, I was hooked by Freud. Freud, got the unconscious, sexual motivation,
cocaine.
repression, all
Yeah.
that stuff. Uh, and I learned that there were ways to study this, and psychology was my best bet. Not wanting to go to med school and become a psychiatrist, I went to the University of Texas at Austin for my PhD, and immediately the first semester I fell out of love with Freud because Freud was a terrible scientist, a terrible thinker. He was, uh, you know, he was obviously influential. He obviously drew a crowd,
In a lot
but
of ways, he seems to be a storyteller
uh,
more than
he was
anything.
a storyteller and a very meandering storyteller that didn't really make a lot of sense. Also, the people who were really into Freud at my university, they were mainly teaching the practice relevant courses like how to do therapy and so on. They were not impressive thinkers.
Hmm.
And instead, at my university, uh, at that time, the Department of Psychology was very strong in the field of behavior genetics, which is one of the things I studied. Uh, and also, my advisor, Lee Willerman, who was a wonderful man, God rest his soul, he taught a graduate course in human sexuality. And during that course, I was, it's time for me to choose a dissertation topic. And there was a unit about sexual orientation, and a paper came out in Science about biological theory of male homosexuality. And he suggested that maybe we could follow that theory up for my dissertation, and it made sense, and that's what I did. And I really enjoyed working with gay and lesbian people more than I had liked working with mentally ill people.
Hmm.
Uh, and also, there were a lot of really interesting open questions. This was again in the late '80s when I was doing this work, and I that's what got me hired, and I've stayed more or less in that general domain, though sexual orientation overlaps some with transsexualism, which is what we used to call it.
Yes.
And I have also become interested in paraphilias. Paraphilias is the scientific current terminology for what used to be called perversions. And one kind of transsexualism is caused in part by paraphilia. But I'm also interested in other controversial paraphilia related topics such as pedophilia, which is, you are interested, we can talk about that kind of thing too. So I'll pause.
That's fascinating. I'll a fun fact is that as a high school student, I got to participate in a mentorship program where we could pick a field and they'd set us up with a professional in that field who we could kind of study with for a semester. And I chose a clinical psychologist. And so when I came to college, I thought that that was what I was going to do. And I declared my major, and there was this program. I don't know if professionals in your discipline use it anymore, but it was called SPSS. Um, and at that point, right, that was when they hit me with the math and this program, and I said, "This is not for me." I switched. I switched to English. So let's talk about the book. The most interesting thing about the book, in some ways, to me, is that this was published in 2003, which is light years ago in terms of sexual politics, and where we are in the United States now. And one of the things that I think just makes the book really fantastic is that you treat the subjects of your study, transgendered people, gay and lesbian people, you treat them with a lot of compassion, right? And it's clear that you have a respect for the objects of your study, and yet you also treat the topic of transgenderism with a healthy dose of skepticism. You seem to be also now, I don't think that the narratives about transgenderism that we have today were maybe quite as strong back then, but you seem willing to explore sort of social dynamics of this as well as biological dynamics of it. and everything in between. And you also, I think, have the courage in the book to acknowledge the questions on which we simply don't have an answer yet. Um, so I guess maybe my first thing, and this probably is a question that bears on my research, but also just in the humanities in general. Um, if we sort of generally associate sort of sexual identitarianism um, with the left, with progressive leftism, which I think at this point those things are twisted up. Which is not to say that everybody who sort of bases their identity off of sexual identity or these kinds of things is necessarily a Democrat or a leftist, but it seems to me that the vanguard of the sexual identity movement is very much sort of aligned with science and perhaps against religion. The reason that this really interests me is because the standard statement of transgendered identity is, yes, on the outside I look like this, but on the inside, right, the real me is this other sex or gender. And to me, when I hear that statement, it smacks very much to me of the idea of the soul. And so it's almost like sort of sexual identitarians and leftists have kind of in a backwards way rediscovered the concept of the soul. And despite the fact that they have these sort of biological scientific pretenses, kind of rely on that concept of the inner self to sort of validate this identity. And I wonder, in that concept of the inner self, how, as a social scientist, do you reckon with such an ethereal idea as an inner self, or if we would go so far, a soul?
Well, um, so first of all, the one of the early uh, activists was a more of a gay activist, though this was so long ago that this was before anything like transsexualism was thought of. His name was Karl Ulrich. Uh, he talked about having the soul of a woman, uh, though he identified more as a gay man. I don't think they had the word gay to describe that, but he wasn't wanting to change into a woman. But it's long been known that gay men also are, uh, on average, more feminine than heterosexual men. Um, so, you know, I'm I'm an atheist, not by choice. I can't help but be an atheist. It's just what I believe, and I don't believe in anything like a soul. Uh, that said, it isn't problematic for me to believe that uh, people can have internal feelings that differ from their external presentation if they're forced by circumstance, say, to present a certain way. A lot. The whole theme of your podcast. There are probably a lot of academics who have the souls of reasonable people, despite what they might say or seem to believe.
So you've said
Um,
something that's very interesting, that despite sort of not believing in a soul, you are saying that there is such a thing as interior phenomena. Um, and it seems to me in your book that you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that the you point towards the formation of that inner self as a product of both nature and nurture, of biology and things like experiences. Is that right? That you think that that takes shape as a mix of those two forces?
so I think that we need to take, you know, 2 or 3 minutes to get more specific about what I wrote about in the book. And so anybody who is sufficiently interested can Google "the man who would be queen," and you will find out that there was, starting in 2003 and going on for several years, a very intense controversy that was caused by some transsexual activists who despised the book because they despised uh, some ideas, and in particular, one idea that I wrote about in the book.
That autogynephilic identity.
Yeah, yeah. So the third section of the book has 3 sections. The first is about uh, boys who want to be girls. The second is about gay men and the way they're feminine and the way they're masculine. And the third is about male to female transsexuals, and uh, was based on the science was based on Ray Blanchard, who's the person who came up with this uh, taxonomy of the 2 types, which I'll explicate in a moment, of male to female transsexuals. The I was lucky enough to meet a trans woman whose actual name is Angelica Celtica, because she's out. In the book, I called her Cher because she liked Cher. And we were friends until the book controversy, and at which point she turned on me. And I think that she did that on the behest of a trans woman named Lynn Conway, who's a very wealthy and influential uh, academic emeritus at University of Michigan. And anyway, these trans women hated was the idea called autogynephilia. Auto, self, gyna, woman, philia, love of. This is a phenomenon in which a male, a natal male, uh, when they develop sexual feelings, they develop sexual arousal to the activity of cross-dressing, typically putting on women's lingerie that they might borrow from their, you know, not explicitly, but they might take their mothers or sisters' bras and panties, look at themselves privately in a mirror, and masturbate. It's a turn on. A subset of autogynephiles also develop sexual interest in the idea of having a woman's body or being a woman. And we don't have time to get into all the evidence and so on, but the evidence suggests that any trans woman who is not exclusively attracted to men and who has not been very feminine from early childhood, which is kind of the stereotype. Any trans woman who's not like that is motivated by autogynephilia, and that would include the ones who were mad at me. So you were asking the question, do I think that that comes from biology, socialization? I believe it comes from biological factors. I don't think there's any plausible explanation why a 14-year-old boy who's never had this demonstrated in front of him gets the idea, hey, I think I'd like to put on female undergarments, and that'll be a turn on. So I think that autogynephilia is inborn. I also think that the other kind of transsexualism, which I think is mainly an extreme form of feminine male homosexuality, I think that's also inborn. Now, what is socially influenced is what one does with this. And I think it's influenced by societal notions like what is the right thing to do. What does it mean when you have these feelings? Well, people. So autogynephilic transsexuals, a lot of them are strongly motivated to believe that they are just like women, and they've even tried to make the argument, some of them, that women also have these turn autogynephilic feelings, like when they put on sexy under things, they get sexually aroused. We have recently published a study showing that that's not true, at least to the same in the same way.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
you mentioned that you believe that this is biological, and yet since the book, especially, the visibility of trans identity in the United States has more or less exploded. In the book, this is of course 20 years ago, you were saying that it's on par with about 1 in 20,000 people who we could classify as transsexual or transgendered. And now I would expect that we would find that number to be much higher in terms of self identification. And so there's a debate going on, as you know, about the question of gender dysphoria as social contagion. Um, and this would, it may well be biological, right, in its true manifestations, right? But I wonder, do you think that that uptick that we're seeing is not a product of the loosening stigma on admitting to these feelings of autogynephilia or these transgender sentiments, but is rather a product of certain social incentives to identify as such? Could you talk a little bit about that question of contagion?
Okay, so for the kinds of males that I've been talking about, again, there are two types. There's the type who's been very feminine boy. Uh, uh, Now, importantly, when I wrote that book, the literature on very feminine boys who wanted to be girls showed that most of them grew out of it by the time they were well into adolescence. In fact, by the time they reached adolescence, most of them had grown out of it. Uh, and I think our culture has changed in ways that prevents them from growing out of it. I think a lot of parents think they're being very progressive and cool by saying, "Oh, I have a trans child. Let me help my child become a girl." And if parents do that, what's going to bring the boy back to boyhood? So yeah, that's and then I think a similar but slightly different uh, uh, mechanism happens for boys with autogynephilia, that they because they don't tell their parents typically, hey, I have these feelings, but they find an online community, and there is in this culture this you know it, it's cool to be trans and it's I think that is probably happening now. There is definitely for girls and possibly for boys a third kind of gender dysphoria that we should talk about. Uh, and this has been called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And this did not used to exist. And the classic case would be a girl who never showed any signs of even being a tomboy, uh, who yet probably has had some signs of being, not totally happy as a child and into adolescence. Uh, Again, gets into some kind of peer group uh, and finds trans ideology and decides fairly suddenly that she might be transgender. Then that progresses to she is transgender. She wants to be a boy, and you know, again, that didn't used to exist. I think
So,
that that is entirely a social construction. That is not to say that these youth would be just entirely healthy and normal had that not happened, because it seems to affect uh, girls with pre-existing problems. And there are some parents in these concerned parent groups who keep uh, pushing me and some of the other scientists. Like, I don't believe that all these boys are autogynephilic. Maybe some of them also have something like rapid onset gender dysphoria, and that is possible, but it's an empirical question. And again, most autogynephilic youth, their parents know nothing because they don't tell parents about their sexual fantasies and what they do in private.
there are ways that we could that empirical studies could be constructed to answer these questions about the extent to which this is a product of social forces, rapid onset gender dysphoria. I wonder, do you know of research that's being done of that sort, or is that just so radioactive that you
You,
just can't touch it?
you earlier in the podcast, you mentioned the study I'm doing with Lisa Lippman and Ken Zucker. That is
That's the
one of
focus.
the big kinds of questions that we're intending to answer.
Interesting.
Uh, yeah.
One thing you mentioned, in this case where a young girl may say, "I want to be a boy," and I think that for many people who are not inhabitants of the university life, or sort of elite corners of society, many people would just say, "Well, I'm sorry, you can't be a boy. You're not a boy." Um, and one of the things that interests me in the book is that you do often seem to grant the authenticity of these identities. You do, for example, use sort of the preferred pronouns of your subjects. And I am somebody who I've thought a good deal about sort of the pronoun craze, and I have my own opinions about it, but I wonder about yours. Is this just a matter of courtesy, or is it just the case that trans women are women?
Well, I think that they're different. There's something in the middle, a choice in the middle there. So, first of all, the trans women that I wrote about uh, were much more committed than some of the people we think of as trans women these days. You know, several of the ones that I wrote about actually got complete sex reassignment surgery, genital reassignment, breast, and
In
so on.
essence, they could pass. Many of these people you were
Some
talking
of
about.
them could pass very well.
Okay.
Uh, Although that is another correlation that autogynephiles don't tend to like, because I say in the book, they don't pass as well as the other type. Um, so, but so I did experience some of them as women, but whether or not I did, I would have certainly referred to them with female pronouns, and I guess I do think it's the courteous thing to do, and I certainly didn't see in 2003 any potential for harm because back then it was quite the rare thing. And, you know, these days, you know, we all have the choice everywhere to put our pronouns forward, which I don't do. But gosh, you know, it's luckily you don't really talking to people. You don't have to use pronouns very often, other than you. And I try to be careful. I don't think I would intentionally, even if you told me to use she and her, I would try to remember to do that.
Yes.
But yeah, it would be
Well,
hard.
it seems to me that it's something increasingly you can't opt out of. And I will tell a recent story of registering for the main conference in my field. You have put in your information for the name tag in advance of the conference, and it had a place for pronouns. And it wouldn't allow me to move past that page until I selected something, right? And in principle, I didn't want to select something, so I clicked other, and in the other box you can write something, and I wrote, please use the pronouns that best accord your visual perception of me,
I think that's
right?
perfect. Yeah.
Look at me and see. Well, when I got to the conference to pick up my name tag, I was excited because I wanted it to say that. Instead, what it said was, ask me about my pronouns. Um, and I wasn't crazy about that, so I crossed out the my, so it just said, ask me about pronouns.
Good.
Um, and
Good.
but I think especially in academic culture, this has become almost obligatory. uh,
And, and it's crazy. I mean, you know, for a, a small proportion of people who have legitimate gender conflict, we are all supposed to announce our pronouns. It's just crazy.
yes.
And you know, and even so, if somebody wants to be called something uh, other than what I might be inclined to call them, just tell me. And I remember I'm a I'm an amateur cyclist, and one of the um, mechanics at my bike store, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, was a very masculine. I thought she was a very masculine female, but went by the name Jake, which should have been the clue. And I did in a three-way conversation. I said she said this, and I could tell that Jake was offended. I felt really bad because I didn't want, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Um, but even then, Jake should have just said, Jake should expect that people, until Jake gets a beard, uh, should expect that people might make that mistake and have to live with it. And the idea that we have to, everybody declare pronouns to avoid things like that happening is silly.
Hmm.
And most people I know find it annoying.
So my area of study, as you know, is rhetoric, and you hinted at this a little bit ago, but 20 years ago, the proper terminology for this phenomenon would have been to call these people transsexuals. Um, and it seems now that this term has very much fallen out of style, and now it's transgendered. If you talk to very smart people 20 years ago, they would have explained to you that sex is a biological category and gender is a social category. And now it seems very much that the very smart people, if you talk to today, will are not so confident that there's this clear dividing line between concepts of sex and gender. Could you talk a little bit about how or why we changed the terminology that we use in talking about this?
So in academia, and I think you will recognize this and probably be more familiar with it than I am, uh, there is a contingent of disciplines that spend a lot of time arguing about terminology and having and changing terminology. Steven Pinker has talked about the euphemism treadmill. Uh, but yeah, and then others like me feel like it's really important to what's important is to be very clear about how you're using words and then to stick with them so that people can understand each other across years and so on. And
Mhm.
I have had arguments with associate editors at one of the journals I most publish in. Uh, she was saying that I could not use the word homosexual because that is I offensive, which is a ridiculous uh, idea, and I pushed back and I used homosexual, and I will continue to use homosexual because it is descriptive and it's not. So the same people who say I can't use homosexual, they're fine with people using the word queer, which
Right.
when I was growing up, queer was an insult.
Right.
I know lots of gay men who detest that word being used and don't want it to be used to describe them.
Mm.
So I think that there's a contingent of people who use language disputes as a way to assert their power and influence. Like, no, we're not saying that this week. You need to say it this way. And I don't play those games.
I had an editor desk reject my article because I used the word dissociative, not referencing mental illness at all, but they said that stigmatizes mentally ill people because it's associated with some psychological conditions, and you need to change that word, dissociative. Um, Okay. So I thought we might move now to a little broader discussion of the discipline of psychology in general. It seems to me that for many years, at least the time that I've been in higher ed, the dominant assumption on the part of people in the natural sciences and the social sciences has been that what we now call wokeism is, pretty well confined to the humanities, and now I think that we're starting to see some people in both the social sciences and the natural sciences wake up to the fact that they are not well defended against the influence of this kind of thinking. I wonder, do you see it? Do you see the wokification of psychology happening? Do you see it influencing the way that scientific principles are applied? Um, that sort of thing.
I do see alarming trends, and that includes both things that are published that are asserting ideological, poorly reasoned arguments, and I also threats to suppress by not publishing ideas that might be offensive to protected minorities, or women are not a minority, but and women, Um,
Hmm.
so I see that. I would say for the most part, psychologists still respect data and they still speak clearly as opposed to, say, gender studies people who have their own, uh, you know, anybody who can understand Judith Butler, um, I would say they're fooling themselves that if they think that they can understand her. So I think that we're still holding on, but uh, the I see all kinds of movement behind the scenes, like at journals and so on, to put out statements about what they're about and how they want to promote social justice and how they want to, uh, you know, oppose things that regardless of validity, things that they think might hurt um, uh, favored groups. The A journal called Nature Human Behavior, which is from the Nature Group, and it's I think a lot of psychologists have published there. It's a recent journal, but it's rapidly became pretty influential by impact factor and so on. But they recently put out a statement just like that that has gotten a lot of pushback, including by heavy hitters like Steven Pinker, who said that he won't review for that journal or
Mm-hmm.
cite it because it's it, the you know the fundamental problem in academia right now is uh, the abandonment of uh, the preeminence of knowledge seeking, or being a scholar should be what all of us, it should be the ambition we all have first, and that is really falling by the wayside right now, and those statements exemplify that.
Mm-hmm. It's not easy to be a scholar, and sometimes I think that the university system in the United States has gotten so large that we've got people in professorships who really don't have the ability to be a scholar in the traditional sense if they wanted to. And what's left when you get there is activism, and at least in my field that makes up a really large chunk of what gets done. um, the replication crisis. I always am excited to talk to psychologists about this. Your field has been, it's not the only field, but it has been at the forefront of this discussion of what we call the replication crisis. That is, published studies that we had heretofore thought to be valid and reliable, it turns out cannot be reproduced. I wonder, from your perspective, what are the causes of this? Are there solutions that are evident, or is this a tempest in a teapot that we really don't need to be that concerned about?
The replication crisis is a serious crisis. Uh, it's actually unlike the crisis in academia that your podcast is mostly focused on. The replication crisis is one I'm quite optimistic about. So, what caused the replication crisis? So, maybe just step back and I'll just say a few words about what it is. And I would say it was around 2010, 2011, 2012. Uh, there was a big awareness, simultaneous awareness, and psychology was probably the discipline where it started. The awareness of the fact that a lot of the findings, including well-known findings published in textbooks and so on, could not be replicated. They could not be repeated in exact studies. And it also, another cause of the replication crisis in psychology was the publication in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology by the psychologist Daryl Bem of I think it was 9 study article purporting to show evidence for precognition, basically ESP. And people looked at that study and said, man, in 8 out of 9 of these studies, he got evidence for ESP. How did that happen? And I think the editors of JPSP said, well, he did it the same way everybody else did. Why we should publish it. And he did it the same way a lot of other people did. Uh, to publish in empirical journals, not just psychology, one needs to get statistically significant findings. You have to get a p-value. It used to be less than 0.05. But and what that means, so I teach, virtually all my teaching now is statistics, and that's in part due to controversy that you haven't mentioned, maybe you don't know about it, which was my 2011 after class demonstration in my human sexuality class, in which I was removed from teaching that class.
I have
Uh,
not heard this. Tell us
oh,
about it.
okay. Well, I will. I'll tell you
Okay.
that. Remind me
All
after
right.
the replication crisis. What a p-value 0.05 means is that if it were actually true that in the general population there was no difference, let's say, between these two groups, uh, I would get an effect, a difference between these two groups, two samples as different as I got, less than 1 out of 20 times, 5 out of 100 times. If
So
that's statistically significant.
is it fair to say that the p-value of 0.05 is something like saying we have a 95% level of confidence in this?
Uh, no, it's not
Okay.
correct. However, that is how everybody was thinking about it,
Okay.
and and they were thinking about it wrong. And So basically, uh, in order to get things published, you have to find these significant findings, and uh, every all scientists want to publish. They want to publish in the best journals, and it turns out that there are things that you can do to get that p-value down to below 0.05. And for the most part, this was not people consciously saying, I am going to cheat. Because if they were going to cheat, just go ahead and make up data. They were actually using the data they had, but there are things that you can do, like remove certain observations, say they're outliers, or you can collect several different dependent variables and choose the ones that turn out. And there are other ways as well. But what we realized is how often people were doing that. It also turns out a p-value of 0.05 is not nearly conservative enough. You want to use smaller p-values.
What would you
So,
say is a strong good p-value?
well, personally, so I work in research where we tend to get large effects with which have very small p-values. So I don't really want to waste my time unless p-value is around 0.001, say.
Wow.
Uh, I might say, well, there's a p-value of 0.01, maybe, but I'm not very confident about that. But so psychology has had over a decade of reckoning with this, and I will say that we have been we have had the, the leaders of this movement to promote replication. A guy named Brian Nozick from University of Virginia has been one, but there have been lots, and they've made good progress promoting best practices and so on. And I'm much more confident that in findings published these days. And one thing I would say is just the whole smell test of a finding. ESP, no, that doesn't smell good. I don't believe it. Uh, and there are other famous examples. But back to so the two crises in science are the replication crisis and the Looniversity crisis. And there's not really any correlation between being concerned about replication and being concerned about the preeminence of scholarship and knowledge, uh, unfortunately.
Hmm.
And so I'm very optimistic about the replication crisis, and I'm uh, not very optimistic currently about the other.
So this is a good transition then to the other, and it sounds like your experience in your human sexuality class may get us down that road. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, I don't. Yeah, I don't think it does really. Although it may have some relevance, but just really quickly. So I used to teach the largest class at Northwestern University, which is a private school. Probably U of H has a bunch of large classes, but this class topped out at around 600 students. I teach it every winter, and part of what students liked was that I would hold optional after class events with speakers, special speakers. And so back when I was friends with the transsexuals, they would come to class, a dominatrix, had a lawyer talk about recovered memories, a bunch of stuff. So one of these in the winter of 2011, I had some people. I think that they were billed themselves as Kiki people, and I was lecturing when they showed up, uh, because they were going to come after class. And I was talking about some Kinsey's, no, I was talking about the phenomenon of female ejaculation,
Hmm.
which I said we don't really understand it. People are skeptical that it even exists. And they heard me say that. And when I was done, you know, we broke for 5 minutes so that students could leave if they wanted to. Coming up, they said, the leader said, uh, she, a woman there, she does female ejaculation. We would like to demonstrate that on stage. Is that okay? And I had been reading a book. It's a good book called Bonk. I forget the author. She's a popular science writer, but it's about all the controversy about sex research, and I had been feeling like, this is stupid that we have all of these inhibitions and so on. So I did not enthusiastically say yes. I said, okay, yeah. And then I warned the class and was very uncomfortable. And I didn't watch, but was told that she did not do the thing despite the attempt. And I was the bad part is that for me was that the editor of the student newspaper was taking the class, and so this became not just a national and international news story. I had friends from the Czech Republic email me, and I think the New York Times did a little article on it. This was this was a big controversy, and at that time, it was more socially conservative parents and reporters and so on who were outraged.
There's only one place in American life where a story like this could occur, and it's
Yeah,
the university.
yeah,
It's just
yeah. So
um,
the dean decided that we wouldn't be offering that class the next year, and it's never been offered again, and it's a shame because it was a good class.
yeah.
But I'll tell you, I'm not sure I would enjoy teaching it anymore
Oh yeah.
because of the
It's a
changes.
minefield. It's a minefield.
Yeah, and I'll also say that the conservative critics, and I got a lot of angry email, and so on. I found them less unpleasant than than what I would anticipate from progressive critics and what I've received from some of my other stuff. So I am currently more considered to be an enemy of the left than an enemy of the right. I'm neither. I am somebody who. So I think that that was a mistake that I made, but it was. I wasn't trying to indoctrinate anybody, or I don't think anybody was harmed. The students actually, in the controversy that followed, students were extremely supportive of me. Put together a pro Bailey petition and so on.
I think that
Uh, yeah.
that situation would unfold much differently in 2021. Um, so the woke university in general. You've been in higher ed since I think you said you were an undergraduate in the late 70s. So you have been around 40 years anyways, like in inside campus life. How did this happen? How did we get here?
So, I quick answer, I don't know. Uh, I actually had lunch with an ex colleague. He moved to a different university, and uh, we agreed that it happened so suddenly. It seemed to happen so suddenly. Couldn't have probably happened that suddenly. There were probably all kinds of things that were uh, happening behind the scenes that people were not aware of. But the crazy part that we hate, that has only begun fairly recently.
When would you say you saw it first? Like at what time, if you were gonna pinpoint a year where you're just like, oh wow, you know?
Well, so I'd say uh, while I was still teaching my human sexuality class, which was always very highly rated, and people were really trying to get into it. But in the last few years, let's say 2009, 10, 11, I started to get some very critical ideological reviews. I mean, and people saying that I was a bad person and so on. That I think, uh, and because of my ideas. Uh, and I suspect those were people from gender studies, which was becoming a more popular major during that time. So I noticed that. I also noticed among some other academics um, and everybody, I guess. But the Trayvon Martin case, which was I think 2012, and the Ferguson, uh, which what was that 2014?
Something like that.
Yeah, I noticed just crazy amount of assertions about the narrative that to question it, which I did. I mean, basically, can we just wait and see what? uh,
Let's get some facts.
yeah, and when we did, those narratives were, not correct. But I just the certainty. So basically, that was when I noticed this insistent idea of systemic police racism, and which has become very influential. And then the summer of 2020, after George Floyd, that's when things went full on crazy.
The mask came off at that point
Yeah,
institutionally.
yeah, that's right.
Can we do anything, or is it lost?
Um, so I don't know. Uh, I think that by saying it's lost, if we were to say it's lost, that would um, surrender the ship, and that so I don't want to do that. Just as I don't think most of us anticipated what happened. I think that we shouldn't be expected to know how we're going to get out of this either. Uh, but I think that the first thing that we should keep in mind is that there are a lot of people who don't like this. Um, the solution that maybe no, that's the wrong word. The goal, not this is not the solution. This is the goal, is to return to being scholars, and to that should be everybody's goal, and anything else should be subsidiary to that. And if it's in conflict, then you can't do it. And so I don't know. Rhetoric is must be somewhat different. I am psychology really is a science, and to be a scholar in psychology needs to be related to the production of knowledge, and to the best of our ability. Furthermore, uh, we should be diving into the most controversial topics. We should be studying. So I'm an expert on transgenderism, transsexualism, whatever you want to call it. That's one of the big issues of the day.
Yeah.
I'm here. Hey, people, let's talk. University presidents, let's talk. Let's argue. Let's debate. Uh, Race should be not a minefield. It should be, we have big problems concerning race, and racial disparities are a problem that we haven't been able to solve, and just blaming racism uh, in the context of serious affirmative action doesn't make any sense at all. Let's talk about the causes of racial disparities and possible solutions. And the academic woke and administrators have increased the most damaging racial disparities uh, in our inner cities. The murder rate of young black men has increased by the biggest increases in recorded history.
Chicago is
Uh,
having a bad year.
Terrible. And who's to blame for that? It's not the police. Uh, it's people who have caused the police to have to back off.
Yep.
And that includes, university presidents who put out statements blaming the police.
Well, this is why I think that, like your call for a return to scholarship and truth seeking is I'm 100% on board with that, but I also know that virtually every professor in many fields who are younger than I am, right? They can't teach that to their graduate students, to the people who will inherit the university, because they don't know it. But even if they did, they wouldn't want it, right? Because they have a telos, a goal that they've decided upon, right? And the truth will be subordinated to the pursuit of that goal, and they will teach their graduate students that this is how it should be. Either teach them that explicitly or through signaling it by the way that they inhabit the field or whatever field that might be. Um, and I think the question at this point for me is really just whether or not it's lost. And I understand that it's unpalatable to think maybe it is, but it's an important question to me because the next question then would be, well, do we start forming alternative institutions? Because if it's savable, then let's stay with it. If it's not, then let's not spend another second, on a sinking ship. Um, and so that's what's your feeling of alternative institutions of sort of just the possibility of a fundamental reimagining of higher education.
I honestly, I think it's a pipe dream, and I'm a fan of Barry Weiss and all the people. Uh,
At
not
Austin.
all, not all, because Deidre McCloskey on the faculty there tried to was one of those trying to get me fired for my book, but
I'm shocked.
most of the rest of them I'm fans of, but I I don't you know who's that going to help the University of Austin? They seem to be envisioning, a version of St. John's University in Austin, which and maybe not 4 year, maybe for older students too, but I'm sure that's going to be really helpful to people who get to go there. But it's not gonna uh, it's not gonna happen in time, and it's not going to be big enough.
I also don't have faith in it. I think that the problem there is it's not just a matter of, well, get professors who are open to truth seeking. The problem is that they've left all of the rest of the structuring of higher ed exactly in place, right? So they've just almost, it seems like, well, if we get a personnel change, that's going to solve it. And it's not.
Yeah, and right, I, yeah. So I think it is a matter of incentives, and incentives have to change, uh, and probably a lot of that has to happen from without rather than within. I'm sure you're aware, for example, of the lawsuit against Texas A&M that just was filed. I, I'm sorry. Who? Remind me. I know this guy. Do you know who I'm talking about?
No, not off the top of my head, I don't.
Ah, okay. I think he's filing a lawsuit based on racial discrimination.
Uh,
Uh, uh, um, so there's a lot of things that can happen if people can get their act together and elect people who will do this and also have the right kinds of goals, which again, it's scholarship. It's I don't think it's uh, replacing one dogma with another, and that's what I worry about.
Mhm.
Um, Also, don't forget uh, those of us like you and me who are still in the university who are trying to do good things. And the University of Austin, I believe that I've heard that they've gotten $150 million
Wow.
of donations. And this big study that I'm conducting with Ken Zucker and Lisa Lippman, we've got barely enough to get that started. And you know, it's what a lot of people want to know. Help us be scholars for good.
We definitely need some patrons. We need some people who see the problem and have money to direct it
We
in the
do,
right
and
places.
we need probably to be a little more organized about what to ask for. There's a lot of movement to Substack, including by a lot of people I respect quite a bit, who've had to leave the academy. So Bo Weingard, I think, is a really smart and decent guy who was fired because he was writing about the issue that you can't write about, which is the role of cognitive differences and racial disparities and the possibility of genetic causes, and shouldn't have been fired. But yeah, he's got a Substack. I don't know how well he's doing.
Seems to be doing
There,
pretty well to me.
well, good, good. Yeah, he continues to write good things on a broad array of issues. Uh, there, yeah, but and then there's Amy Wax, who I'm not going to take a position right here about the validity of the things that she's been saying. I will say, however, that there's no way in the world that she should lose her tenure over those things. Her tenure should be protected, and she is under serious threat, and she has a GoFundMe, and she has another alternative source of you can Google how to donate, and I donated, and again, it's because uh, tenure is important and under threat. I also donated to Charles Nagy, who won his case.
Yeah.
But it would be good if we didn't wait till we were at threat to of losing our tenure. It would be good if we had particular things rather than starting a new university that we could ask for money for. And I think there are. I've been very unhappy, depressed about this, seeking mutual social support by other academics, and I've been kind of disheartened by how few academics have been interested in any kind of organizing. However, there are some, and it's been difficult to get any resources to do anything for the
Yeah.
groups who, to bring in a speaker, or, we're not getting any money from our universities to bring in anybody, uh, or uh, to start a website. I've been, another project that I want to announce before we're done, and I have no time constraints, but you probably do. Uh, I am on the board of something called Society for Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences, with people like Lee Jessam, Richard Redding, who is our founding president, um, Corey Clark, some other really good people, and we're intending to start a journal to publish difficult research and so on. But
Fantastic. I know that Lee Jussum is also involved with Researchers One, which hosts my new journal, the Peerless Review. Mike, you've been kind of a dose of optimism. You might not feel like you might not feel like you have been, but you are somewhat more optimistic than most of the people I've talked to about these things. And given that the lawnmowers have now started in earnest across the street, I think it might be a good place to end our conversation. But I want to thank you again for the work that you're doing and for just the intellectual honesty that I've seen in your work, and also your willingness to, you know, call a spade in terms of what's going on in higher ed. So thanks for joining us. It's been my pleasure.
mine too, Adam. And thanks for the effort in putting together this podcast. It's been a source of enjoyment and sustenance for me. So
Well,
thank you.
thanks. We'll have you on again sometime.
Okay.
Professor Michael Bailey, Northwestern University.